Hi, welcome to Hillcrest Sermons, growing together.
Show us your heart's delight.
Good to see you. How's everybody doing? Good. So nice outside. Don't you feel like we really earned this? This year we earned this. We get this. I'm trying to do everything outside. You know, everything that's like publicly acceptable, I want to be outside for right now. It's one of the things that I love about Hillcrest is open windows, open doors, kind of light flowing through here. So we hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Hillcrest in the summer, which is always a unique event. We kind of squeeze together like this too. I love to be able to see your faces up close. We call this whole season Summer is Better Together. And you're joining us in the middle of a series that's called On the Path of Jesus, Stories from the Holy Land. I don't think I introduced myself. I saw a bunch of new faces today, but my name's Christian Lindbeck. I'm the very grateful lead pastor here at Hillcrest Church. So along with the rest of the team and this whole community, actually, it's just my pleasure to welcome you. I'm glad to have you gathered here this morning. So here's the deal. Each week during the summer, and they all work together, but they work as kind of standalones too, somebody, me or somebody who's been on one of these trips to Israel with us is going to come back and bring part of their story home to us so that we can all grow from this opportunity together. And like we said over the past couple weeks, we want it to be fun. I think like living room slideshow kind of fun for those of you who think that sort of thing's fun. Some people told me like slideshow's the worst thing ever, Christian, find a different idea. I'm like, I love a slideshow. Inspiring, I'm like, oh, I understand or I get it. Inspiring both for how the land, the people, the culture, the language, the customs tell the story, and inspiring maybe even to go there. And really just helpful for our community. Helpful for growing in faith. That's really our intent. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, the whole reason we do these trips to Israel is that they're discipleship opportunities. They're just a great place for us to learn about who God is, who this Jesus is that we follow, and what does that say about us? How do we go about following him? Because he so frequently used the land, the people, the customs, and the culture to teach his lesson. So, one of the funny things about this tour is, so Tim and I think this was my 9th or 10th tour, and Tim and I have done a couple of tours together, and Tim and I do a lot of things out of the ordinary. Sometimes for our friends on the ground, frustratingly out of the ordinary. Tim and I want everything custom, so we design this whole thing, and our partners on the ground frequently say, we're weird. And he tries to assure us he means that in a nice way. You know, how people do. You're so weird. I mean like in a good way, right? But what he says he means by weird is you guys don't do things the way people do things. This isn't what people do. And I got to tell you, Tim and I thrive on that kind of weird. Like every time he tells us that, we're like, yeah, exactly, right? So we do these things intentionally, and it really starts for us right at the beginning. So getting to Israel is no joke. It's a long ways away, and it's typically complicated flying, and no matter what, it just takes a long time. So after many, many hours of what is normally complicated flying and traveling, when we arrive in Tel Aviv, we get on the bus, and we do not first go up to the grandeur and spectacle of Jerusalem, which most trips would do, or nor do we retreat north up into the quiet country solitude of Galilee. Nope. We get on a bus and we drive 2 hours due south out into the Negev desert. So that's that big triangle. See the arrow that I've put on there? It just drives south out into the middle of nothing on purpose. And that is because we intentionally want to start our first few days in the Holy Land informed by these kinds of places. Sometimes you look at a picture like that, the surface of Mars. Nope. That is the Negev desert. And we start here because we want to set the trajectory. Like where you start lays a foundation. We want to set a foundation, and we want to start the trajectory of this whole trip, this whole journey through Israel in desert austerity. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the key reasons is that desert austerity, the desert experience, is a key identity shaping season in the whole Hebrew story. You have to remember that Abram and Sarah were called out of Mesopotamia into the promised land, and they spent some of their most shaping time south in the desert in a city called Beersheba. Now, we try to remind you that Mesopotamia, like that is the place of easy living, like pleasurable living. Like water is abundant and gardens are lush and food is everywhere and the mountains are snow-capped, right? So it is a place where abundant living is easy. So they came from wealth, technological advancements. They came from plush living to this. Because God brought them there to teach them something about who he is and something about who they are. So his promised son, Isaac spends time in the same place in Beersheba learning. And his son, Isaac's son, Jacob, also in Beersheba learning. In fact, when the people of Israel finally escape the hardships of Egypt, Egypt is another place where water flows abundantly. Do you remember when Tim and I talk about watering with your toe in Egypt? Have you heard us say that? The water, the irrigation was so abundant that when you needed water in your garden, you just dragged your toe over. There would be like water running through the garden. You just make a new little path. And you just drag your toe over, and then water just flows into your garden. And then when you're done, you just sort of push the abundant water closed. This is very different than the experience of need, like absolute need that is generated in the desert. So they leave the abundance of Egypt, which they complain about a lot, and they find themselves living and learning for 40 years in those lean desert landscapes that I just showed you. And I think what I want to suggest to you, both for them and for us, and we've already kind of touched on this theme a little bit in song and in confession today, is that there seems to be kind of fundamental lessons from the desert that God intends to teach his people. That there's a foundation, like a trajectory-setting thing that happens in the desert. So he takes them to the desert intentionally before he takes them up into the mountains. Before he takes them into the lush coastal plains or the rolling hills of the Shephelah, first, he takes them to the desert. Before he takes them into successful empire building, he says, before you have to come up against cunning enemies or hard circumstances, there's something that I want to learn or teach you, and I want you to learn a key lesson about life in the desert. And so that is why we start our tours in the desert. That's why we wanted this lesson relatively up front in this series. Because the desert has important lessons. The wasteland, the wild places have lessons to teach people who follow God. And quite frankly, the lessons begin to teach themselves as soon as you get there. So we arrive. One of the first things you learn when you wake up the next day is that you are not in Kansas anymore. The desert is H-O-T hot. Like we get there in June and it is hot. It is like exhausting. It is dangerous. Everything is pokey or wants to bite you in the desert. It is skin-crackingly arid, and it is plainly scarce on at least what you would call obvious resources. We start the very first day by riding camels out into the desert. It's kind of a fun touristy thing to do for about 15 minutes. About an hour in, you know what it is? Hot and uncomfortable. And hot and uncomfortable is part of the plan. I want people to feel, in fact, if you look at Tim and I's notes, day one, it says, make people feel the heat. I see some people who've been on the trip all with us like, you feel the heat. That's our intent. I want you to be uncomfortably hot. I want you to feel the heat, understand the need. I want you to see that it is the kind of place, man, I could take off on like 40 sermons today, but hear this, because there's a sense in which as a people, as a country, we're entering into wilderness spaces. It's a place where carelessness will cost you your life. This is not a tropical landscape. Anybody ever been to someplace like Costa Rica? Raise your hand. It's okay. You're not in trouble. I'm not dealing drugs or anything. If you're like, I went to Costa Rica. It's cool. Costa Rica's great. My impression when I was in Costa Rica is you barely need anything to stay alive. Like maybe a leaf to cover you in the rain, but food, you just turn around. Food is growing on everything. It's not that kind of a place. It's the kind of place where a lack of shelter means death. It's a hard landscape. The heat of the day, in some seasons, the brutal cold of night. It's a place where food is only found through wisdom. I have a place, that is what's called abundant food in the desert. We often talk about the shepherd who leads us into green pastures. That is a wildly green pasture in the desert. This is spring abundance. Is that what you had in mind? That's like crazy abundance right there. So that's a wadi full of abundance, but you have to know where to go and how to find it. It's a place where both during the day, the sky is vast during the day and gleaming, and at night especially. It's a place that makes our smallness seem more obvious. In the desert, you are tiny. The desert is huge, and you are small. The universe is vast, and you are insignificant. It's a place where our daily need is absolutely practical. Our reliance on each other and God seems less like a good philosophical idea and more like an absolute necessity. You don't make it in the desert without a provider God and without people around you. And like I said, God brings his people into the desert before he takes them into abundance, and he intentionally lingers there. Yeah, even long before they mess up and forget the primary lesson they're supposed to be learning and have to spend 40 years in the desert, relearning the same lessons in the same places. Even before that, he takes them to the desert for a solid year. He's identity shaping them in the desert. He takes them to the desert to display his character, shape their identity, and I want you to hear this, to prepare them for the rest of the journey. He knows they're going to go into the hotly contested promised land. He knows they're going to face crisis. He knows they're going to face enemies. He knows they're going to face loneliness. He knows they're going to face fear. And so he needs to, he's like, I know you're coming into a season where it's going to be hard. I need to teach you something important. I need to prepare you. How about this? I need to prepare you for abundance too. I'm going to prepare you for hardship, but I'm going to prepare you also for abundance. There's fundamental things that I need to teach you. I want to pull a little bit about that journey because I want you to see God intentionally means to prepare his people, and we get to be included in his people. I'm going to start in Exodus 3, verse 17. It says, now when Pharaoh had finally let the people go, God did not lead them through the way of the land of the Philistines. Listen, although it was nearby. That was the easy way to go. For God said, lest the people change their mind when they see war, face hardship, and they just turn around, tuck tail, and return to Egypt. That's my translation. Therefore, God led the people around through the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea. And the children of Israel then went up prepared for war out of the land of Egypt. They took their journey on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. So he takes them this way intentionally to prepare them. Also from the Psalms in remembrance of this time, Psalm 78. It says, he did in this time miracles in their sight, in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt. He divided the sea and led them through. He made the water stand up like a wall. He guided them again with the cloud by day and with the light from fire at night. He split the rocks in the wilderness, and he gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of the rocky crag, and he made water flow down like rivers. But, and I might say, I'm going to add again, they failed to learn their lesson, some of them, and they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the wilderness, same word, wilderness, desert, the wild, continuing to rebel against the Most High. So something about their journey through the desert, again, 40 sermons in this, because if you are in a desert place, facing a desert place, getting ready to be on a desert journey, and I mean that metaphorically, something about their journey through the desert was supposed to prepare them for life with God. God did not take them the quick way because he had things he needed to teach them first. That's my 5th sermon I could take off on right there. God does not take them the quick way because there's things he needed to teach them first. Now, we have some record of his preparation. We see if you go to where he gave the law at Sinai, the famous 10 Commandments. This is part of their preparation. We see them being prepared as they move through the desert. And I just want you to notice, you go read Exodus, Deuteronomy as much as you want. Nowhere do you will see mention that they are being prepared in military strategy or hand-to-hand combat. Yea, verily, did it not say, Moses did thus teach them in hand-to-hand combat, right? All of their training, preparation, lessons seem to be centrally focused on, listen, the trustworthiness and provision of God. Before I send you into abundance and you think you did it at your own hand, it comes from my hand. Before I send you into hard places and you think you must scramble in fear, remember, I am the God who provides enough. When we're on the trip, it only takes one afternoon in the Negev to learn this lesson. Maybe one day up on Masada. Here's a few pictures from us in Masada. Now, what you can't tell in that picture right away, you can tell, you can just flip through them. It's okay, Vic. What you can tell is that there's nothing around. What you can't tell, but I'd love to tell you, is it is hot. Or marveling at the caves of Qumran. We go to Qumran. We don't get to Qumran until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And by 2 o'clock, it's roughly, 6 or 7 million degrees. It takes doing those things before you fully appreciate that God, when he says he's the cloud shade umbrella, that's what it says. I'm a cloud shade umbrella over you during the day. You're like, I see the miracle provision that you are, God. This is us sitting in the shade. It actually is 100 and some degrees in this moment, and just a little bit of shade provides the utmost relief. God is the cloud shade umbrella of our life. Shade in the day, fire at night. In fact, from just those two, the people of God, cloud and fire, learn the central desert lesson. Let me go to Exodus again. It says, in all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out as instructed. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out, listen, until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night in the sight of all the Israelites during their travels. Listen, desert, this is, how do you learn trust? Here's a good trust lesson. You go when I go, you stay when I stay. Now, this is going to bother everybody on some level of the spectrum. But you don't have to fess up to this, I will. But I want to know, you can just do it in your heart. Who are my goer, planner, doer, get it done kind of people? Okay, this always hits me like a ton of bricks. Because I'm like, there's something that needs to be done. You know how you get it done? You start doing it. Like now, let's do it now. It's midnight. Yep, seems like a good time. Let's get at it, right? So I always want to like turn the knobs and pull the ropes and adjust the levers. I want to do stuff. And I think God is saying, hey, busy pants. Shh. I think how many times do you think they said, God, promised land's right there. Like I can see it. And he's like, shh, we're still learning. Like, wait. He just has this wait. You don't go ahead without. How do you learn trust? Because sometimes you think, I know exactly what the thing to do is, and God says the thing for you to do is wait and be still. Now, it gets people on the other end of the spectrum, too. I don't know who my setup people are, but some people, they want to have their whole world totally set up. That's when they're at peace. Just imagine you're living in the desert and you finally got it figured out. You know where the trash goes, you know who sweeps the sand, And then he moves. You're like, come on. I finally just got the whole thing done. Now we're moving to another spot in the desert. Right? Like before you get too cozy, when I go, you go. When I stay, you stay. When I go, you go. He's constantly teaching this lesson that the world is not what we just make of it, what we manipulate, what we make happen. This desert lesson of trusting in God. Now, I think one of the things that's hard for us is we live in a land of abundant provision. We're surrounded by opportunities. You see, so if the lesson is, dear one, be still because you are not in charge of the world, you don't make of it what you can manipulate out of it, you have to trust me, that's less true here. Because turns out I can manipulate all kinds of things into existence. We got resources, we have natural resources, financial resources, friendship resources. For most of us, we can, in fact, make the world that we want. And if you just drop scruples out of the equation, you can get almost anything you want. That's why the desert is so key, because guess, in the desert, you can manipulate nothing. There's nothing to manipulate. Sandcastles? That's it. So your existence as a secondary manipulator becomes obvious. Safety, water, these are like from the hand of God. And the desert teaches this lesson first. So what in the world could God be teaching them and teaching us? I think it's only the most important lesson of our entire life. I think I can make it really simple. He is trustworthy. Why the desert? Why the desert for him? Why the desert for us? Why is life a classroom? What are we learning in this classroom? I think we are primarily learning that he is trustworthy, and the desert is a wonderful place to learn it. You see, we just have this teeny tiny, like we think we're like manipulating the world and making it happen, but we have this pinprick perspective on the world. Imagine the world as a map, world size, laid out flat. And our entire view of things is one pinhole poked into the map. And maybe you can see one color on the map, and you are freaking out because the world is not working out, or you're making grand plans, and our perspective is just itty-bitty, teeny tiny. And God, who has the grand perspective, is saying, you can trust me in the midst of life. I am trustworthy, and I am the God who provides enough. I think it's interesting. There's so many places we could look at this in the desert, but even if you didn't grow up in church, maybe from movies or just stories, you're familiar with the miracle of manna in the desert. Okay, this is a miracle of trusting God who brings enough. In fact, it's just a miracle of enough, right? So here's the deal with manna, in case you haven't read about it. They were to collect manna 6 days a week, and there would always be just enough manna for them to collect. And then on the sixth day of the week, they would collect manna for 2 days. And then on the seventh day of the week, it wouldn't rot. They'd have enough. The manna would last through that seventh day, a day of rest, where they're fundamentally learning, you can trust me all week, and then there's a day of the week where you can stop trying to provide for yourself. Stop trying to get it done. Stop trying to manipulate the world and make it your own thing. There's a day where you just trust me that there will be enough. And over, he teaches them this lesson to be still and trust God. Now, famously, they fail some of these lessons. Exodus 16:20 says, however, some paid no attention to Moses, and they kept part of the manna till morning, but always it was full of maggots and began to smell. I wanted abundance when there was just enough. In the same way they lamented leaving Egypt, as they often did. It's funny the things that we lament. They said, we want meat to eat. If only God would give us meat, we'd be happy. Numbers 11 says, we were better off in Egypt where we had meat to eat. Moses said, oh, the Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it. Sometimes God gives you the thing you want in abundance until it becomes its own grim lesson in broken trust. Over and over in the desert, God teaches his people about who they are and who they will be corporately. The right way to build a nation, an organization, and a church that will be different from the people around them. Not a people built on power, military might, competition, or hoarding resources, but a kingdom built on daily trust and reliance in God with enough for each day, enough to be generous, enough to be a blessing to the world and especially the vulnerable around him. This is the preparation they, and I would argue we, quite frankly, need. You see, the desert rightly humbles us. And I mean this now if you go to the desert, but I, of course, also mean those desert moments in our life. The desert rightly humbles us. The wilderness reveals the true direction of our hearts. The desert shows us our need. The desert draws us together and inclines us towards God. The desert is a void. It's a place where there are fewer distractions. It gives us a place to hear from God, a place to quiet down, lean into trust, and learn. It's quite interesting, just poetically to note, Hebrew's built mostly on 3 consonantal words, and the word for desert is midbar, and you get these 3 central consonants, D, B, R, which is also, if you take those same consonants, you can make the word debir, which means speaking, or the word dabar, which means a word, like a word. So quite frankly, poetically, the desert is a place you go where you hear God speaking his word. You see, now it's free of distraction. And you are sure about your reliant need on God. Where do you go to hear the voice of God? Not often to the places of abundance and distraction, but often to the places of austerity and quiet. It's interesting to note then, it's the same word in the New Testament appears as eremos, a wilderness or a lonely place. And so I think it's interesting to note that it says Jesus frequently finds an eremos place. You know, when he started his ministry, where did he go first? The wilderness, the desert, the Judean wilderness. He goes first before he starts his ministry of abundance and of challenge to the desert, to be near the Father who is speaking to him who is the Word. I love that throughout his ministry, Jesus revisited this key lesson in his life. Mark 1:35 says, rising very early before the dawn. And I always interpret that as because that's the only time people would leave him alone. Anybody who's raised kids know you have to get about 5 a.m. So you just get a moment of silence before you lovely monsters are awake. Right. He left and went off to a deserted, an eremos place, a desert place where he prayed. So friends, what does this all mean? Tim and I take people to this place so we can begin our trip not in the hype of a vacation or the excitement of an adventure, which is there. And we come here so we can first start in the humility of need, in the exhaustion of heat, in the frayed nerves of a long trip and a new place in uncomfortable circumstances. Who does that? Who intentionally starts a trip that way? I can tell you that those words are often easier to say and ideas to appreciate than there are lessons to live. And little did we know that on this last trip we took, we'd begin to live these lessons and lean into that trust so much. I think some of you have heard that this amazing and worthwhile trip was also hampered by some serious challenges. And we found ourselves having to say over and over again, Lord, we trust you in the middle of this, even though from our perspective it's a mess. And we are practicing surrendering to you in loving trust. I'll let others share their stories, but I want you to know for me, it was an increasingly lived lesson over and over. And I, day by day, was managing disappointment, my own and the disappointment of others, frustration, sometimes anger from others, sadness, confusion, hardship, all intermingled with being physically and emotionally exhausted from just the power and beauty of the place, too. But for me, it was when I functionally lost Tim as my co-leader, who's also one of my best friends in the world. On that day, we left 12 people behind on a really important day because they needed to rest. And on that same day, I had all my money, my passport, my ID, my credit cards, all my cash, everything stolen 2 days before we were supposed to get on a plane and fly home. I don't want to exaggerate. This was an awesome trip. I loved it, and all those things are replaceable. But I'll just say out loud, I was sad. I was holding on, like I'm gonna finish this exhausting trip. I'm gonna go home, and I'm gonna go on a vacation with my family. And that just got tanked right in the toilet. That vacation went away. And I just recall living these lessons over and over and over. And I found myself saying over and over, God is trustworthy, and there is enough. And man, I want you to know I prayed for a miraculous answer, and I asked other people to pray, Lord, I pray that whoever stole this packback will grow a conscience in Jesus' name. Or that they will throw the backpack down after stealing the considerable amount of cash that I had foolishly left in there. And they will return the things they do not need, like my passport. And none of those things happened. And I remember the day God told me, let it go. I am not going to provide the miracle that you are praying for. I am going to be with you in the midst of this and provide in ways you do not expect. And as soon as I did that, I was like, I was just at peace to be in the middle of it. And he did. Like, did all those things come back and my headaches go away? No. Not even since I got home. It's been a headache for all kinds of other reasons. But he has showed himself a provider, and often in the generosity and kindness of others. And so the lesson of the desert comes home to our everyday lives. That sometimes it's hard for us to see in the abundance of Bellingham or in the ways we work. And not for all. Some live in a place of profound need. But I just want to ask you today, where do you need to remember the lessons from the desert in your own life? And I give you a couple minutes to step into an eremos, a quiet place, where you can be still, where you can trust, where you can listen to God speaking about his word made flesh in Jesus, the inviolable hope of the one who is more than enough. And before Carlo comes up, I want you to just, if you've got something to write in, or if you can just be still, I offer you the gift that is infrequently given: silence.
Thanks for listening. For more info, visit hcbellingham.com and join us any Sunday, 9 and 11 a.m.